open every City Club forum with the club's iconic bell. So let's get the conference started. Leon?
Hello, everyone, and it is good to be with you today. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to have a fine time today, I guarantee that. It is just a pleasure for me to be here with you. The City Club proudly welcomes Jeff Fager, who became the chairman of CBS News in February 2011 after reshaping its flagship broadcast, 60 Minutes, into an editorial, more vibrant and news-conscious program. His efforts to improve the hit program online have also made the 60 Minutes brand a hit on the internet and the model of successful electronic journalism in the digital age. In his new role, he continues to oversee 60 Minutes while executing his plan to transfer that success to all of the news division's platforms on television, radio, the internet. Fager comes to the chairman's position with more than 30 years of experience at every stage of the electronic news business, including 15 years at the executive producer level, 7 of those at the helm of 60 Minutes. For his work, the Producers Guild of America voted him Best Producer in Nonfiction Television 4 times, and TV Week named him its top 10 list of most powerful television news executives. Fager's accolades include 33 Emmys, 8 Peabodys, 8 RTDNA Edward R. Murrow Awards, 4 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University batons, and 3 Investigative Reporting and Editing Awards. Fager graduated from Colgate University in 1977 with a BA degree in English, and his astute, sophisticated storytelling has enlightened news audiences ever since. We are honored today to Cleveland and welcome Jeff Fager to our stage.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Leon and Jan. It's a real honor to be here. This great conference in this terrific city and beautiful hall. Such a nice place to have it. You know, I think we share a lot in common. Broadcast 60 Minutes in this conference. We care about similar things, and I want to talk about that in terms of what we stand for at 60 Minutes and how we've been able to succeed in an environment where real reporting is hard to come by. But first, I really want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite practitioners of free speech, Andy Rooney. How many people are there in the world who for 30 years, every single Sunday night on primetime television, got to say whatever the hell they want? That's Andy Rooney. I mean, what an amazing run he's had. And, you know, I think he made the best of that opportunity. Because it wasn't just all about filling cereal boxes and all the other things he'd put on his desk. Andy talked about real issues that bothered him. And I think even though some people, and he would say he was on one side, not the other, it really was always hard to tell. But people always ask me, what's he like in real life? And he really is one of my very favorite people. I love Andy Rooney. And I'm going to miss not having him on at the end of every broadcast. If you didn't see, he announced he's going to stop doing it on a weekly basis. But people ask me, what kind of guy is he? And he's exactly the guy you see on television. He just says it as it is in life. And he really is a perfect metaphor for this kind of conference. But I remember a story I wanted to tell is about Andy happens to be a bit of a party animal. He never misses a party. And I've seen him at so many with his maker's mark on the rocks, looking for conversation. And at one particular party at the Super Bowl that I was with him at, a man came up who I know well. Bruce Taub is his name. I said, Andy, you need to know, you should meet Bruce Taub. He's the chief financial officer of the CBS television network. And he signs your check every single week. He's responsible for all that money at CBS. And Andy looked at him without losing a beat and said, well, nobody's perfect. And walked away. So, but I do want to talk about the broadcast that he ended for so many years, 60 Minutes, and we are entering our 44th season in prime time. I think, as I said, I think it is a perfect subject for this kind of gathering. We're broadcast journalists in a prominent place on television, the most successful commercial primetime television lineup for the past 10 years, almost in history of television. It does so well at CBS television. And we're thriving as a news magazine in the middle of that. Last night in prime time, we had a story about the revolution in Egypt. We had a story about the job czar, Jeff Immelt, and how we're going to get out of this jobs mess. Most of you were probably partying at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and didn't see it. Is that true? Anybody see 60 Minutes last night? Okay. And those are important stories, and yet we still garnered more than 15 million people watching the broadcast last night. That's almost 3 times more than anybody who does what we do, making it by far the number one news program in America. We're also number one in per capita egomaniacs, all gathered on one floor. But I think the real question is, how do we do that? How do we succeed in prime time in an environment where broadcast journalism has become so much about covering crime stories, has become so much about soft stories and sensationalism in that environment? And that's what I really want to talk about today, because it's not accidental. And it's not as if we haven't upset the apple cart plenty. We've upset some pretty important advertisers over the years. But our goal is to cover important stories and to shed light on them, to use our resources to help people better understand the important stories of the day, and to uncover important information in the public's best interest that somebody might want hidden. And I think that our success doing that says a lot about America, and it says a lot about broadcast journalism. I think we prove every single week that Americans are hungry for the kind of reporting that we put on Sunday nights. And part of it is because there's so little of it on TV. It's a particularly exciting time for us at CBS News. Putting Scott Pelley in the anchor chair of the CBS Evening News this past June was one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done. He's CBS through and through. He's covered more stories, seen more countries, covered more wars, covered more everything than anybody who ever anchored an evening newscast in the 60 years since they've been on the air. He fits our identity, what we're good at: real news, original reporting by experienced reporters. It's not as if we could go after tabloid journalism or chase sensational stories. We wouldn't be good at that at all. But when the head of CBS, Les Moonves, asked me to run CBS News, it was for one reason. He's proud of 60 Minutes, we all are, and he wants the rest of CBS News to be more like it. We brought a great old institution, 60 Minutes, up to date without compromising its core values and judgments and traditions. In fact, we moved closer to them. I think it's also reaffirming within our own organization that somebody who grew up inside CBS News would be running it. I covered the world for CBS News: floods, famines, wars, summits. And 8 years ago, I took on one of the most dangerous assignments of all, replacing Don Hewitt at 60 Minutes. Replacing a legend is not easy. As my pal, the great director of the broadcast, said, quoting our favorite Reagan line, "Jeff, don't worry, they'll be with you through thick." I said, "Artie, what happened to thin?" He said, "Welcome to 60 Minutes." But the truth is that it was probably one of the worst years ever at CBS News, 2004. About 4 months after I took the job in charge of 60 Minutes, my old broadcast, 60 Minutes 2, aired the famous President Bush National Guard story. Questionable documents and all. Boy, we all know how a piece like that can bring an entire organization down. No doubt about it, one of the most serious threats to a free press is a big mistake, without an apology or a correction, particularly when it's flawed the way it was flawed. From what I know of it, from the very beginning, because it seems the people involved in that story, top quality people, made a mistake that I think is a common denominator with a lot of stories gone bad. They had their minds made up before they set out to report the story. And then they set out to prove it. When that happens, you tend to leave any mitigating factors out because they might work against your theory. And only disaster can come of that. Talk about hurting the spirit of a free press and free speech. It can be so badly harmed when it's used to prove a point. I worked with the same team on the Abu Ghraib prison story. We took months to verify the authenticity of the photos in that story and held back several photos we couldn't be sure about. As difficult as it was to report such a troubling story, we were proud when we broke it. One of the most important stories ever reported at CBS News. To me, it helps define what reporting is all about. It may sound a little extreme, but it was one of the press barons, Beaverbrook, who said it so well. News is what somebody's trying to hide. All else is advertising. Just think about it. Think about it. Because it makes a lot of sense. I've never experienced pressure, by the way, as intense as we got from the Pentagon to not run that story. We were not proud as an organization the fall of the Bush document story. I was beginning my first season at 60 Minutes, and it was hard. All of CBS News was reeling from the accusations that the documents were phony. It was bad at 60 Minutes because many people thought it was us, not 60 Minutes 2, that had done the story. It was the beginning of a very, very bad year, and I think at 60 Minutes we were in a bit of a rut anyway. I'll never forget one of the first seasons that aired that season. One of the first stories that aired that season was a story about Jon Stewart. Steve Kroft had done it. And in the interview with Jon Stewart, he said to Steve Kroft, "You know, I like your broadcast, but I don't think you have a very good slogan." And Steve said, "You know, we don't have a slogan." And Jon said, "Yes, you do." And Steve said, "Well, wait, what is it? I don't think we have one." He said, "Yes, you do. May cause drowsiness." And it wasn't far from the truth. I think one of the biggest weaknesses at 60 Minutes is that we were stockpiling stories that could run at any time. Evergreens. That season, 2004, we had almost half of our stories done as the season began, in September, as it always does. And that can be a very bad thing. It means that those stories aren't current, for one. It means they'd have to hold up for an entire year. It also means that beyond that, there were other problems. We were doing too many celebrity stories. There was too much fluff and not enough hard reporting. And we lost quite a few viewers that year. We were down about 10%, making it about the 10th year in a row at 60 Minutes we were losing viewers. We needed to change, and we did. We made many more of our stories more relevant, focused our resources on far more serious investigative reporting, and it paid off for us in a big way. For the first time in a decade, the audience started to grow. And I believe strongly that in the process, we proved something important that goes against conventional wisdom in broadcast journalism. Americans want good reporting about the important stories of our time. Beyond that, it was in keeping with our core values, taught to us by Don Hewitt, the great creator of 60 Minutes, who learned everything he knew from one of the founders of CBS News, Fred Friendly. 60 years of CBS News tradition passed down through two people. It's also a great source of pride in that, and I talk about it all the time. We're lucky to inherit such a great tradition. We need to honor it. We need to be proud of what we do first, and all else will follow. We believe so strongly that if we're proud of the work, the audience will come to see it. And so we don't look at audience research to decide what we're going to cover. Because the trick is to take whatever story you're going to do, particularly the important ones that aren't being done elsewhere, that may be more difficult to tell, and work on every single line, work on every single phrase to make it as interesting as we possibly can. We go over it and try to make it better and better. We also work as hard as we can to make it as accurate and fair as possible. We have one person at 60 Minutes dedicated to reading every single transcript. It's all that she does of every single interview ever done at 60 Minutes. So we're sure we aren't taking somebody out of context. It is laborious to get each Sunday's broadcast on the air, and often it doesn't get finished until Sunday late in the afternoon of the show. But it's a labor of love, and the sense of pride in our shop is palpable. We always work towards a healthy mix of stories, with adventures and profiles and stories that we like to do because they're just plain interesting or fun. I think people often misunderstand hard news or real news to mean serious news. It's not. The world is a harsh enough place with a lot of bad news, particularly in difficult times. And I believe we need to mix it up with some of what's good in the world. First and foremost, the way I think about it when I produce a broadcast is to make it a fulfilling experience for the viewer. I got something out of that. I learned, I laughed, I heard something I didn't know, I saw something I'd never seen. The most amazing part about the broadcast under those circumstances is the growth in total viewers. Last season, this one just ended, we gained 75,000 to an average every single Sunday of 13.5 million. And that is in light of the fact that in broadcast journalism today, it is conventional wisdom that covering important stories does not sell. And by important, I also mean something that is widely ignored, the war in Afghanistan, in broadcast television. To me, that's an incredible fact, and it's true. The evening newscasts do a good job of covering it from time to time, but not nearly enough considering how much we've invested, that there are 100,000 Americans on the ground there. My favorite number to prove the point that we have succeeded against that conventional wisdom is something that the Nielsen Company calls the CUME, which measures the total number of people who watch the show at least once in a television season. That number for 60 Minutes this past TV season is stunning. Nielsen reported that just under 121 million people watched 60 Minutes at least once this past TV season. The most watched non-sports program of the year. American Idol was second. It's one of my favorite stats. And as I said, the numbers contradict what I hear from relatively intelligent network news people, that the American public doesn't want to hear about Afghanistan, that it's a turnoff even though 100,000 Americans are fighting there. That's the judgment made across the country. The same goes for other important stories. When it comes to jobs and the economy, ramifications of the worst recession since the Great Depression. Instead, most of our direct competitors in prime time have gone towards crime, have gone towards sensationalism. And it isn't just a turnoff factor, but that's part of what they believe. By doing audience research, it shows that Americans are turned off hearing about the war in Afghanistan. Therefore, if you cover it, they'll change the channel. That Americans are turned off when they hear about the recession because people don't want to have bad news like this delivered to them. And I think our whole point is that you can cover anything if you make it interesting, and the American public is hungry for it. The other thing I hear that I think we have in common in terms of this group and 60 Minutes is the forces that work against good broadcast journalism, and they can be intimidating forces. And I've referred to the market forces, which are strong, and the research-driven forces, and the pressure on news organizations to generate ratings and revenue. That so much can get in the way when people believe that their numbers are going down because they're covering the wrong thing. And look at what news organizations have been willing to do in the interest of getting sensational stories in the air or in print. There are examples just this summer of networks paying for interviews. And consider the horrendous case of the phone hacking in England. The outrage of all of that this past summer. Lord knows what else might be going on, by the way, that's similar, or here in this country. What will they be willing to do to get the Amanda Knox interview? Imagine the promises. I actually have a hunch about her. She may just go with 60 Minutes, and all we promise is fairness and accuracy. I heard recently that one of the networks, major networks, offered something I'd never heard of: editability to an interview subject. Think about that, editability. What does that word mean? Telling the subject that they could edit out whatever they didn't like once the interview was complete. Imagine giving that up. That's not a free press. That's not free speech. That's a press that is beholden to the subject of the interview, prepared to bargain away the whole truth in the interest of attracting a bigger audience. Real news can be risky. It's also expensive, very expensive. Our story budgets are way bigger than the budgets of our competitors. And it's dangerous. Send someone into a war zone. We've lost people. Sometimes people will go to great lengths to try to distort what you're reporting, which is also a huge threat and obstacle in terms of more people doing real reporting, particularly in the age of the internet and the blogosphere. One example that I'll try not to spend too much time on was a story we did last spring on Lance Armstrong. It was an impeccably reported story, uncovering details of testimony to a grand jury, indicating a systematic doping program on Lance Armstrong's U.S. Postal team over many years. He hired public relations people to disparage the reporting. They called it shoddy. And one night, after midnight, they sent me a letter saying that, shoddy reporting. And I was asleep, but they also sent it to every major news source in the country. And so it was picked up and actually published in so many different places, including the Washington Post, online, with just their part of the story, public relations firm that Deep Pockets had hired to disparage our reporting. It wasn't until 2 or 3 that afternoon that we got our response together. We had a million things going on that day. I didn't realize it had gone so out of control. I had a call from the Washington Post, and yet by the time I got around to returning the call, it was 4 hours after they'd published their piece, without even a quote from us. To me, that's another area that is frightening, that you will put a story out before you've reported both sides of it. And there was not one single bit of truth in their letter. Not one single bit. And there was not even a single denial to the charges that were made in our story. I'm going to close now and open it up to questions, but I wanted to talk a little bit about 60 Minutes and our heritage, and someone we just lost, a man named Joe Warshpa, who I'm sure nobody has heard of in this room, but he was such an important figure in our history. Joe Warshpa was one of the original producers at 60 Minutes. He was one of the first people brought in. They brought in about 6 producers at the time. But Warshpa was a big Edward R. Murrow partner. In fact, in the movie Good Night and Good Luck that George Clooney made, Joe Warshpa and his wife Shirley were featured as Murrow's assistants and producers in going after Joe McCarthy. He was played by Robert Downey Jr. in that movie, but the reason I want to mention him is because he was a major influence in setting the values and standards that we stick to. That fairness and accuracy is the most important part, and was to him. And that if you had an agenda, you shouldn't be working here. We understate as opposed to overstate. We never hype. The writing is spare and clean and is always easy to follow. To this day, we go over every line. Those are things that Joe Worshper brought and influenced our broadcast. And something Don Hewitt said to me the first day I got to 60 Minutes. We don't have any meetings and we don't have any memos. Just bring us good stories and everything will be fine. And I thought, wow, what a great place to work. What I didn't realize at the time is that Joe Worshper was the reason for no meetings at 60 Minutes. Because Joe was upset in the first or second year of 60 Minutes. The only record of the broadcast was a transcript that got put out, and it had the name of the correspondent and the name of the story, and it didn't have the name of the producer. So he gathered everybody together on the staff, and they had a big meeting, and it was incredibly contentious, a now very famous meeting. And there was a lot of screaming and shouting and a lot of cursing, and which is another aspect of 60 Minutes that I love to this day. It's straight talk. Everybody says what's on their mind, and Joe Worshper always said what was on his mind. But 20 minutes later, Don Hewitt stormed out, upset that it was just so contentious, slammed the door and shouted, "That's the last goddamn meeting we'll ever have at 60 Minutes." And that's it. That's a huge part of what makes the broadcast terrific to this day. So I'd love to open it up to questions. And I think that Leon is going to moderate it.
You'll have a seat over there. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Fager.
Thank you.
By the way, just one housekeeping thing. Some people have talked about the lights which may be in your eyes. The lights are needed for television. So please bear with us, but you're on television, so we'll deal with that. In traditional City Club fashion, we'll have a question and answer period, and we welcome questions from everyone, including our guests. Please respond to the microphones located on either aisle. Keep your questions short and concise so that Jeff can respond to as many questions as possible. You'll see the microphones right over there. If you wish to tweet from your seat or from our website audience, please tweet your question to Free Speech CLE or comment on our blog. And Jeff Fager, I'll ask the first question as we get started, as people start moving toward the microphones. Jeff, as you harden 60 Minutes more, bringing in more news, and your audience numbers went up, what did that tell you?
Well, it was encouraging because, as I've said, that's, I believe, what we stand for, what we do well. It would be hard for us to go in another direction. So I do believe that it's a bargain you make, that you do your best to report, especially what we believe we are about. The kind of stories that we're going to report, to see it succeed was just a great lift for all of us.
We've got a tweet here that says, from St. Luke's Foundation, "You can't bargain away the truth in order to attract a bigger audience."
Yeah, I believe that, actually. I think that the audience is a lot smarter than people give them credit. I think that the worst thing you can do as a broadcast journalist, as any journalist, is to offend them by underestimating the intelligence of the American people.
We've got a question over here.
Good morning, Mr. Fager. Stuart Musinski from Project Love Purple America. 4 weeks ago, my organization facilitated a civility forum in Washington with Representatives Emanuel Cleaver and Tim Johnson, the leaders of the House Civility Movement. And in that forum, Representative Cleaver, when asked about the gridlock and venom in Washington, said that part of the problem is the media, that the media goes after red meat. And if there is civility, the media doesn't go after civility. In fact, he said that maybe we should baptize the media and convert them to looking at things differently. So, in your opinion, is there a role for the media to do a shifting of perspective now with the lack of civility around our country, for the media to take responsibility for looking at the good news, for looking at what's good and happening in America, as opposed to, as they say, if it bleeds, it leads, you know, that kind of perspective.
I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges, because I do believe that we don't report the good enough. But right now, I think it's kind of hard to find a lot of good in Washington. So I actually think that's unfair to the media, though I think it's a crazy world we live in now in terms of cable news. At night, when it all becomes about something heated, it doesn't all become that, but a lot of it does. It's a strange moment in our country. It's a lot bigger than the media, I think. It's our job to report a gridlock as much as it is to report what's working, but let's face it, right now it's not working that well. They don't seem to agree on anything.
But those who do agree, how come you're not reporting those stories?
Well, I guess I think that's a good point. I mean, look, we actually had Jeff Immelt on last night. He's a significant CEO of GE. He was hired by the president to be the job czar. He's a Republican. I thought it was a pretty good example of people who are agreeing about how to get jobs from a Republican's perspective and the president's perspective. We didn't have the president in the story. We had his job czar in the story. And I think that is an example of something where there's hope that maybe he can make a difference. A corporate executive who's gathered a lot of corporate executives together, and a collection of different people from the country who represent different parties and different perspectives, trying to take a bipartisan approach, a nonpartisan approach, to spurring job growth in America. So I think last night was an example of that on 60 Minutes. Is there not enough of that? Probably not.
Okay. Let's squeeze in a question from over here on the left side, my left at least.
Thank you. Hi, Jim Foster. To return to a subject that was obviously painful for you, the President Bush story, you said that the worst thing is a uncorrected story. Obviously, you did get that wrong. Can you tell us what you did to go back and try to correct the record, and can you really balance that out? A story is more sensational when it goes out the first time. How can you equalize or balance the scale? And please do tell us what you did.
I actually was not in charge of that, and I wish I was. I was trying to suggest at the time that the people who were involved in it apologize, or at least explain that there might have been a mistake. I just believe that the press doesn't do that enough. And this was a horrible example of that not happening. It became painfully obvious in a short amount of time that there was something wrong with the documents they used in that story. And all you have to do is to go on and tell people, we think there's something wrong with it, and we're looking into it. To me, we make mistakes. I think this mistake was born of something more serious that threatens journalism, which was what I had mentioned, trying to set out to prove something. I just don't think that, I think that that's always a dangerous path to be on, and I like to think that that doesn't happen at 60 Minutes ever, but I know it could, and it does. So to me, that's the most important lesson from that. There are several, but I guess the one you bring up is high on that list, which is, if you've made a mistake, you better recognize it and tell people you recognize it, and start looking into what went wrong, and be very transparent about that. I just think that, especially the press, when we hold people to certain standards, we should be held to the highest of standards.
That gives you enormous credibility to admit that you've made a mistake on the air, and people see that you are human just like everyone else.
I believe it does.
Let's take a question over here.
Broadcast journalism exists in a regulatory environment that doesn't apply to the print media, and I wondered if you would talk about that and how the relationship with the FCC affects your exercise of the constitutional right of free speech and freedom of the press. And if there's a story maybe you could tell about where you've actively thought about the regulatory framework as it applied to a particular story or to your day-to-day work?
You know, I really don't think about it that much. I think that it does have an impact on the business in this sense. Maybe it's positive. I know that in the recent takeover of NBC, part of what Comcast, the company that took it over, was very public about saying is that they want more public service, and they are adding a news magazine that promises to be about important stories. That's a positive result. I don't feel that we are affected until it comes to election time, and then I just think that there should be a natural fairness when it comes to election time and broadcasters are on, though there aren't rules. The fairness doctrine was important at one point, but I don't think it's necessary with good journalism. I believe that it's our job to help people better understand candidates and to do that by not just covering the horse race, which I think we do way too much of, but by hearing what they believe in, what they want to do, what they would do on the issues that are important to Americans. So it's not as prevalent, and I think probably because it's become there's so many different outlets. There's so many different broadcasters. There's so much in cable. There's so much on television. There's so much on the internet. The old days of 3 television networks that need to be watched carefully, I think, has pretty much gone.
Well, if I can ask a follow-up, what's your observation of the print media? You took a little shot at the Washington Post in your discussion of that one example. Is it your observation that they, who don't have that kind of regulatory oversight, generally speaking, exercise their obligations effectively and fairly?
No, I do think they do. I think that the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are just the greatest news organizations to this day. I don't want to be misinterpreted on that. It's amazing what they do on a daily basis. What I was talking about is actually a very separate issue in terms of the worry that I have about the internet and about the need to put a story out on a 24-hour news cycle. I think that's a separate issue. I don't think that that's going to be a government issue because I don't know what you do about it. Maybe it is at some point. But to me, it's much more about the fear of the 24-hour news cycle, which I have, and to me that's an example of that, given that the Washington Post is journalistically one of the most credible news organizations in this country and has been an amazing tradition, and does great reporting on a daily basis.
We have a question right here from a lady right here.
This is quite the opposite of the 24-hour news cycle. The pressure on newspapers has become such that many of them, of course, have shortened their coverage or shortened their coverage area. And consequently, they tend to run very elaborate and long stories about a single subject. And corollary to that, we see collaboration among news media, radio, TV, newspaper, and in this community, public radio as well and public TV, to cover a single series or a single story. And as much as I appreciate that, it brings up the question as to whether or not the winnowing of the news is giving us the wrong perspective or too narrow a perspective.
Well, I think that it's going to be a very interesting and difficult period. It has been for the newspaper business. I don't speak about it as an expert. I just know that there are concerns because the next version of the newspaper has not quite been invented yet. I think that I as a reader, look at the national papers in the country, the Times and the Post and the Journal and the LA Times, and I know that they've gone through some difficulty, but they still do such an amazing job of covering the world. I think that there's obviously a big concern in the newspaper business in terms of the smaller papers that are struggling to make ends meet. I think that's a scary phenomenon. I think that the newspapers drive the news business in this country still to this day. Television doesn't drive the news business.
Very interesting.
Do you see, are people getting confused with chat on more chat on some news channels and news? Are they confusing the two?
I do think that that's the case. I think that if you go back to some of the more traditional definitions of news, it's hard to find on television. Mm-hmm. And that's a concern too.
Okay. We've got a question over here.
Yes. When George Bush was president, I understand from friends in other cities that everywhere he went there were protests. And I remember here in Cleveland, when he came to talk about his faith-based initiative early in his presidency, there were over 1,000 people protesting. And the National Press Corps, I watched them because I was there, went by in as many black vehicles as, 20 or 30 of them. They never covered the protest of 1,000 people here in Cleveland. By contrast, when Obama became president, every protest, no matter how small, seemed to be covered. And I particularly am referring to the Tea Party. And if you bring that up to the present time, there was, I think, a generally agreed sort of blackout of the coverage of the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. And when Bush was president, I thought, okay, the National Press Corps doesn't cover protests. But it certainly covered everything that the Tea Party did. And now when we have, people, again, protesting now widely across the country and the world, how is it that these protests aren't getting the coverage that much smaller protests done by the Tea Party get?
Are you accusing the press of having a conservative bias? This is great.
This is sort of a long way of saying that.
This is great. I love it. I don't think it's true. I don't know about the protests in the Bush period, but I just think that this Occupy Wall Street movement has gotten a hell of a lot of coverage. And I do believe that if you were really honestly looking at the press, and you got to see and talk to everybody, you probably would see a more liberal bias. I believe that. So I'm not sure I believe your conclusion is accurate, and the times are different as well. Let's face it, in the Bush years when so much is driven by the economy, I think, and when you have so many people concerned and upset about the economy and about this problem we have with creating jobs and so many jobless people, and at the same time having been through this horrific recession, which so many believe was created, by horrible mistakes in terms of the mortgage crisis and packaging those mortgage securities. I think that this is a moment that where people are more upset, and I don't think it's not. I don't think it's lacking for coverage. I think some people consider it's overcovered right now. This Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street.
Thank you for your question. Let's take one over here.
I think it's fair to say that CBS is perceived to belong to the liberal media elite.
Whoops, okay. This is a direct opposite now.
I said perceived to be.
Good.
To what extent does that characterization, lobbied at you largely by the right wing or by Republicans, influence your choices? How much do you bend over backwards to sort of give the lie to that, or how much does that influence your coverage?
I just think it's such a good question, because I'm, for one, so sensitive to that accusation because it disturbs me. And so I worry sometimes that the response to that is going overboard the other way, and I think that's your point. I don't think it's fair. I think that you could draw that conclusion based on some of what's happened at CBS over the years, and I think that it has a liberal bias. And I think that Bush document story helped feed that story that was aired right before the election. national election. So it's something to, but I think it's something that we have to carefully watch to guard against, that not to go the other way, not to be looking to somehow show that we're not a liberal slant, so we're going to have a conservative slant, and to be so impartial and have absolutely take no sides in anything, which I believe in so strongly. I feel like when you've been in this business long enough, you can see if someone's coming at it from a certain perspective or direction. I've been a student of fairness most of my career. It's something you really have to look for. Is someone being fair here? It's one of the reasons that we have at 60 Minutes that individual I mentioned who actually looks at every single transcript to make sure, wait a minute, you're using a quote from him which indicates he felt this way, but at another part in the interview, he actually, it sounds like he wasn't all that sure. So there are subtleties that you have to watch for in fairness, and it's not easy. And I think in journalism overall, it isn't practiced very well.
I've got a question here on the tweet from Like a Color TV. Next version of the newspaper has not quite been invented yet. What will it look like, and when will we see it?
I think you're holding it.
I'm holding it.
I really don't know. There are better people to answer that question than me by far, but I for one, look at some newspapers on my iPad, and I think it's exciting. It's hard to get weaned when you're like me. I love to feel the newspaper, but I already find myself doing it. I already find myself going to my iPad and looking at a newspaper. So I'm encouraged about it based on this invention.
If you're like me, my kids don't even take the newspaper. I still have it delivered in the morning, at the morning front door. But my kids, this is all they do, the younger generation. Let's take a question over here.
Yes. I may have missed it, but I'm still waiting, or I've overlooked the definitive report by CBS or anybody else on what really was the truth about President Bush's military record. And listening to you this morning, I wondered whether the understandable embarrassment by CBS and by news organizations generally over the way that was initially handled has perhaps deterred you or anyone else from picking that story up and doing some more digging and letting the American people know what really happened with his military record, if it's possible to discover that and find that out. The 2004 election is long gone, his presidency is long gone, but it seems to me, at least as a matter of historical interest, it still would be nice to know whether there was a problem there or not.
You know, I think that it's a question of importance, too, in terms of where you're going to put your resources. And personally, I'm not sure that when you're 25 or 26, whatever he was, that it's of that much value to know what exactly happened. I do think that there's a right to know and a need to know when there's a president sending kids into war. But I also think that part of what I discovered in reading, there was a significant report done about it, in an internal investigation at CBS about it, was that just enough to shed a little bit of skepticism on the conclusion that he had at the time just completely abandoned all responsibility, is that his commanding officer had said that he had asked to be a pilot in Vietnam, that he wanted to go to Vietnam, and that he was bored. So in other words, there's enough about both sides of that story that make it questionable in terms of his reputation, because that's really what is at question, I think. Do you want to follow up on that?
Well, just to comment that I would certainly personally be more interested in learning more about that before I'd be interested in watching Amanda Knox.
Yeah.
We have 3.5 minutes remaining in this segment.
Mr. Fager, thank you very much for being here and our kickoff speaker. I have an incident I want to relate to you. It was before your time, so nothing personal, about 60 Minutes. And I state it only because I hope you can reassure me after you hear this talk. Some years ago, 60 Minutes went out to Illinois Power to do a story about nuclear power, much of Chicago being covered by nuclear power. IP declined to let them do it, to do a story. They feared or had reason to believe that it was not going to be a balanced story. Sometime later, 60 Minutes came back, and they were quite insistent that they'd be able to do a story on it. And IP and Illinois Power agreed to do it on the basis that they could take a cameraman along to film everything that the 60 Minute cameraman filmed, which they agreed to. What came out on that night when it was broadcast was considerably different in the eyes of IP. And they, in turn, put out a tape that showed what they said versus what was on 60 Minutes that night. The reason I'm aware of that is because our local power company, then called the Cleveland Illuminating Company, put copies of that out. A number of people saw that, and it was a stark contrast. And it turned me off on 60 Minutes at that point. I'm now back on. I thought last night's program was great, particularly that football agent, how arrogant he was. Beside that, I'm just curious, how are you taken to make sure we don't have repetition of that?
Yeah, I love the question, and God knows I know that in 44 years of 60 Minutes, there have been mistakes and some of them fairness issues. I feel so strongly that at the end of the day, when we broadcast our story, that if you didn't like it and you were in it, at least you thought it was fair. That has to be the response. Now we get criticism from both sides of a story on a regular basis, and that's important too. But it has to be. But I feel so strongly that if someone says, "Boy, not only was the story wrong, but they treated it unfairly," that to me is the worst kind of criticism. And I look at all the mail. I think that's important. I feel strongly that. And we watch this as carefully as we can, and that's part of what I mentioned by the one editor who only looks at transcripts, that you may not have liked it, you may have thought, boy, oh boy, that was tough, but boy, it was fair too. To me, that is what you seek and hope for in every story that we do. Care about that above all else. Because what we sell is our credibility. You left the broadcast because our credibility was damaged in your mind by that piece. If that happens once and you lose one person that way, you've made a terrible mistake. So fairness and credibility and accuracy are just first and foremost, I think, in journalism.
I've got one.
Thank you.
I've got less than a minute remaining. Just a quick comment on local news. You get around the country, what do you think of local news?
Well, I worked in local news. I started in my, right out of college in local news, and I spent 5 years before I got to CBS. And one boss of mine, who I'll never forget, he was a very colorful guy, put it this way. He said, "Look, we're not here to make the news. We're just here to scare people into watching it."
Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Fager, chairman of CBS News.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.